video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager.
Zimbabwe are in trouble again. 134 all out. This was the World Cup that they thought they were going to get some respect. But in their last game against England, they can't even put up a decent total. And their World Cup started so well. They made 300 against Sri Lanka and then took regular wickets until the Lankans got home with 3 balls and wickets in hand. They also put up a decent fight against Pakistan as well, but they couldn't make the runs fast enough to really scare them. Also, they ran into a young quick called Wassim Akram who took 3 for 21. Another young player, Brian Lara, knocked the ball around for a while for the West Indies, and there was no way that Zimbabwe ever going to put a proper dent in that kind of a chase. The match against New Zealand was a mess. It wasn't really their fault. Rain and a terrible system that existed pre-Duckworth-Lewis meant that they had to chase 154 runs in 18 overs. That may not sound like a lot today, but in 1992 ODI money, that was like 1 million runs. The same thing kind of happened in the India game as well. Of course, another young guy, Sachin Tendulkar, was around too. But they were, according to their system at the time, 50 runs behind where they needed to be when the final rain came. South Africa toyed with them a little bit like food, and it is an absolute sin that the ICC won't put up all of Kepler Wessel's 70 from 137 balls as a highlight package. This all meant that coming into the last game, the Zimbabweans were really struggling. So having England, one of the best teams in that tournament, to play and then only making 134, it meant that they were probably going to go home without a win. Except that is not what happened. Because what followed was perhaps the greatest spell by a chicken farmer in the history of World Cup cricket. And why am I thinking about this now? Because England have just asked Zimbabwe to tour them again. The series will take place in 2025 if the world is still running by then. And the last time Zimbabwe played England was 2007. I'm aware that a vast majority of you may not have been born then. Overall, you will not be surprised to know that England has beaten Zimbabwe a lot. But wait a minute, what is going on here at the start? Because Zimbabwe is doing something absolutely special. It is actually worth looking at just the 90s alone. And I'm cheating a little because I threw in one from early 2000 as well. But remember that Zimbabwe didn't play their first test until 1992. So this is not how you would expect their record to be against one of the biggest teams in the world. Of course, it is worth remembering that England were absolutely terrible through much of the 90s. And so that certainly played a part. But even then, they should not have lost to Zimbabwe, and certainly not this many times. This is just bad. There's no way to talk yourself around this. Zimbabwe were just entering cricket, and they were hammering a team who invented the sport. In 96-97, England toured Zimbabwe for 5 matches, 3 ODIs and 2 tests. England did not win a single match. And of course, they found a way to embarrass themselves even further when they were chasing 205 in the first test. They were smashing the ball all around everywhere, even though Zimbabwe was going in on some of the most defensive bowling that you will ever come across. They were tossing the ball miles down leg side with hugely defensive fields to try and hold on for a draw. But still, England got very close until it came down to the final ball and England couldn't just get enough. And that is fine. They clearly dominated the draw, and had the umpires been a little bit more friendly to them on the leg side defensive bowling, they probably would have won that match. So David Bumble Lloyd, England's then coach, went on one of the weirdest rants for a match that ended up in a draw ever. It was a bit like England claiming they had won the test at Edgbaston, but even more aggressive than that. An England leader saying all this in a draw against Zimbabwe was not an ideal look. And of course, it looked all that much more odd because England were playing a team who in their first 20 tests had a single victory. Congratulations, Team England. You almost beat a team that almost never beats anyone in test matches. But if you look through England's time against Zimbabwe, you'll keep finding fun things. Like, this is one of the most amazing quadrangular ODI series ever. It was not an ODI series, really, because one of the teams was Australia A, so it's kind of an ODI and List A series. But England went up against Australia A and Zimbabwe in this 4-team tournament, and England ended up behind Australia A. But why? That's because Zimbabwe blew England away on the back of Grant Elliott's 84 not out from 143 balls. And if you don't know, that's Andy's brother and one of the slowest scoring players in the history of cricket. So this was a truly special loss. And it wasn't even the only time a Zimbabwean grinder squeezed out a victory against them. Alistair Campbell made an 80 from 136 in this chase. And Zimbabwe were a plucky team. They had the ability to stay with you a little bit. And England in this era almost never blew teams away, meaning that they were very ripe for a team that wouldn't go away. So Zimbabwe's long order of guys who could chip it around were very handy, as were the couple of decent spinners that they found. His streak was obviously very good, and a lot of medium-fast guys who just hit the top of off-stump over and over again. But that was certainly the heyday of Zimbabwean cricket. And the only time inside England now that Zimbabwe gets mentioned a lot is when they're talking about Jimmy Anderson's debut, which on its own just shows you how long he has actually played cricket, especially as the vast majority of even his career they haven't played against Zimbabwe. But England did play Zimbabwe an incredible amount from 2000 until 2004. And since then, the only match was at a T20 World Cup, which of course was not scheduled by England or Zimbabwe. And of course, since 2007, Zimbabwe hasn't always been an active team, or even existing, or paying their players, or whatever was going on with them. But it's still way too long between games. And we're not throwing England under the bus here. There's a lot of teams who have just decided that it is not worth playing Zimbabwe at all anymore, which is such a shame because everyone enjoyed them in the 90s. But it is worth remembering that when Anderson made his debut against Zimbabwe, his first over went for 18 runs. That batter was Dion Ibrahim, who averaged 22 in tests with a strike rate of 39. It's about the least likely person to take down a 600 wicket taker as you will ever find. And there is a win here that I need to explain a little bit better. In the 2003 World Cup, Zimbabwe beat England, and because of that, they made it through to the Super Sixes while England failed again. But Zimbabwe did not win that game because England decided to forfeit it because of safety concerns and also because Robert Mugabe was still around. This was actually after the Henry Olonga and Andy Flower protests, but there was also death threats from the sons and daughters of Zimbabwe to the England team specifically. It just seemed one way or another in that kind of era that Zimbabwe was going to find a way to beat England. But that does take us back to that incredible game in 1992. Remember, Zimbabwe had made 134 all out. But while that seems like a low total, it is worth remembering that this was the first and last ODI ever in a small regional centre called Albury that is halfway between Melbourne and Sydney. It was an odd place for a World Cup game. It was really a club pitch that just shouldn't have been used for this level of contest. The bounce off that wicket was all over the shop. Look at Andy Flower here. This was a man who averaged 50 in tests, and this ball has come up off a length to smack him just on the gloves. This was not a decent wicket, but 134 just isn't a lot of runs, especially against a team that would go pretty close to winning the entire tournament. And at the break of innings, former England player Geoffrey Boycott went up to then captain and now Zimbabwe coach Dave Houghton to tell him how amateur Zimbabwe were. This was a real low point for Zimbabwe cricket. However, no one seemed to have told the most famous chicken farmer in cricketing history. Eddo Brandes was a big barrel-chested fast bowler who was famous for his sledging, his build and his lack of fitness. In fact, the two things that really held him back the most was a lack of confidence and that lack of fitness. He should have probably been leading Zimbabwe's pace attack for a decade. But this was the day where we saw the best of the chicken farmer Eddo Brandes. He took 4 wickets that left England 43 for 5. But I think it's the last one that is the most interesting. The batter here was Hick, who was of course playing for England, because when he came through as a young Zimbabwean, they were just nowhere near good enough to ever get anywhere near test matches. And not only was Hick a Zimbabwean, but he was also a close personal friend of Eddo Brandes. And in many ways, Hick, even if he ultimately did not become the player that everyone hoped he would, certainly became the most English Zimbabwean story of that era. Because at this stage, at best, Zimbabwe were just a feeder team for either England or South Africa. But it was this match that really changed that. And they had to fight for it. For instance, Alex Stewart made 29 from 96 balls, and a sick Neil Fairbrother fought very hard before he was finally taken by an incredible Andy Flower catch. You can actually see that he is at leg slip when he takes this. Just remarkable work. But eventually, England would need 11 runs with 2 wickets in hand, and they were close when Richard Illingworth was run out. And in the final over, Gladstone Small flicked one to short mid wicket, and Zimbabwe had won perhaps the most important match in their history. This was the game that got Zimbabwe test status. It was the one that changed their cricket future completely. In 2025, Zimbabwe cricket is now so removed from that 1992 period, but they are going through their second greatest period after that era. And in 2025, we might not see anything like a chicken farmer run through England. But for Zimbabwe, it isn't just about changing their future again. It's just having a chance to play at all.